by the construction of the bridges at the east end and by the steeply graded mound. The city's most famous thoroughfare, Princes Street, stretches for nearly a mile on the north side of the former Nor Loch, now laid out as public gardens, through which the railway runs in a cutting. Princes Street was also the focal point of the city's tram system. For nearly 85 years, millions were conveyed by horse, cable and electric trams for business, work and pleasure. The cars brought the middle-class residents from the south side suburbs to the elegant streets of the new town. They transported the tenement dwellers. They carried visitors to the zoo, to the races at Musselburgh, to the international rugby matches at Murrayfield, to the football grounds, the housing estates, the places of entertainment, education and worship. They conveyed people to the railway stations. They brought the workers to the warehouses, factories and docks of the busy port of Leith. The trams were given a tremendous send-off when the last cars ran into Shrub Hill on Friday evening, November the 16th, 1956. The story had started in 1871, when the city's first standard gauge horse tram line was opened, linking Haymarket to Bernard Street in the independent borough of Leith. To tackle steep grades on the north side, the cable-hauled Trinity route was opened in 1888, running 1.5 miles from Golden Acre to Hanover Street. A second, shorter line linking Cumley Bank to Frederick Street followed in 1890. An engine house and depot was built at Henderson Row. The facade of this building has been carefully preserved. "20 six-window blue and white cars were eventually provided. In 1897, these original routes were absorbed by the Edinburgh and District Tramways Company, which had been formed to convert the horse system to cable operation. Work progressed rapidly between 1899 and 1907, with new power stations being built at Shrub Hill, Toll Cross and Portobello. Leith, objecting to cable trams, purchased the horse lines within its boundaries, converting them to electric traction in August 1905, eventually operating a fleet of 36 open and top-covered cars. The livery was Munich Lake and Ivory. Although not physically connected, interchange between the two systems was made in the middle of Leith Walk, at a spot dubbed the Pilrig Muddle by long-suffering passengers. At Joppa, connection was made with the independent Musselburgh Company line to Port Seton, which was opened progressively between 1904 and 1909. The last horse trams shuttled from Toll Cross along Collington Road until replaced by cable cars in August 1907. Between 1899 and 1903, a fleet of about 200 48-seater cable trams was delivered from different manufacturers. They had 3-window saloons, orthodox platforms, entrances and stairs, together with inside frame bogies with the gripper mounted ahead of the first axle. They were numbered variously between 1 and 228. Top covers were fitted to cars built after 1906 and subsequently added to some of the older vehicles. Four were converted to work a new 1.5-mile electric line linking Ardmillan Terrace and Slateford. This was Edinburgh's first electric tram route and operated from 1910 to 1919. Following the First World War, transport in Edinburgh underwent a radical transformation. Firstly, in 1919, the city took over control of the now run-down and unpopular cable car system and embarked upon a policy of electrification. Secondly, in November 1920, following amalgamation of Edinburgh and Leith, responsibility for the latter's tramway passed to the newly created Edinburgh Corporation Tramways Department. Through working between the two formerly separate undertakings, was restored on the 20th of June 1922, with electrification of the lines to the south via the bridges. The last cable cars were hauled along the Portobello route on the 23rd of June 1923. As a result, Corporation and Musselburgh Company cars now worked jointly from the post office to Port Seaton. Today there are few reminders of the cable network, once the fifth largest in the world. A length of track is preserved in Waterloo Place, and beneath the city streets are the tunnels, which once carried the miles of cables. During the Second World War they were used as air raid shelters. Neil Mackenzie points out one interesting feature.
These were almost certain are the little brackets which carried the insulators for the telephone cables, telephone wires, because at various places on the cable system there were pits between the tracks, and there was some poor unfortunate chap down there watching the cables as they whirled along over his head at about anything from 8 to 12.5 miles an hour, and he was supposed to check that there weren't any snags or anything which might get caught in the ploughs on the cable cars. There's several of those around. I'm not entirely sure what they are, but they're still used here.
Once electrification of the former cable car routes was completed, a few new extensions were built, shown here in green, including tracks along George Street with a view to alleviating congestion on Princes Street. On the debit side, the Port Seaton route was cut back to Leavenhall in March 1928, Edinburgh eventually purchasing the Joppa-Leavenhall section for £3,000 in 1931. Present-day remains of the former Musselburgh Company line include these rails at Prestonpans. And the former depot, which continued to be passed by corporation trams until 1954. The Edinburgh Power Station was situated at Portobello. Electricity was generated by huge turbo alternators at 6,600 volts. For the trams, this was reduced to 600 volts DC by means of several substations. From these, the power was conveyed to the overhead wires by underground feeder cables by means of hundreds of section boxes. A fleet of tower wagons was available for emergencies. Most of the cable fleet was modified for electric operation. Some had been fitted with new top covers prior to conversion, most followed, although some remained open toppers until withdrawn. The ex-Leith cars were allocated the numbers 231 to 267. Those with top covers were, in keeping with the ex-cable trams, fitted with vestibules and longer wheelbase trucks. Between 1922 and 1934, over 200 new or partly new trams entered service. Known latterly as the wooden standards, they were built not only at Shrub Hill, but also by a variety of outside manufacturers. They had 4-window lower saloons and open balconies. From 1930 onwards, these were enclosed. Some had new Shrub Hill-built lower saloons under former cable car top decks, such as 191 seen in the background. 367, the first of a new design of totally enclosed car, entered service in 1929. A further dozen followed. Replacing the remaining ex-Leith open toppers, numbers 250 to 259 were built by Pickering of Wishaw in 1932-3. Known as the Pickerings or 250s, they were the first Edinburgh trams to have headlights, although the former Leith cars had always had them. 16 experimental trams entered service between 1932 and 34, the most famous being the lightweight, flush-sided, metal-framed number 180. Built at Shrub Hill for £4,000, this luxurious new vehicle was christened Red Biddy, on account of its striking pillar-box red and grey livery. Two all-steel cars followed in 1933. Built by Metro Camel of Birmingham, they differed from 180 in having no curved glass and a more angular appearance. Built at Shrub Hill in 1933, Hybrid 261 was of composite construction and resembled a flush-sided Pickering. In 1934, Metro Camel supplied 6 dome-roofed versions of 260 and 265. They also had distinctive flat corner panels. They were mounted on Maley and Taunton trucks, as were 3 similar cars built by Hearst Nelson. These were distinguished by curved corner panels. One result of this experimentation was the delivery of 23 steel-built, sloping-fronted streamliners, all built by outside contractors in 1934-5. The last 6 could be identified by centrally mounted colour light panels, with the number box positioned on the near side corner. They were variously mounted on Maley and Taunton and Peckham P22 trucks. A new steel-built standard design emerged from Shrub Hill in 1934, incorporating technical aspects from the various experimental vehicles. Known as the Shrub Hill Standards, they were distinguished by their dome-shaped roofs. They were of composite construction, sat 62 passengers on transverse seats, and were mounted on Peckham P22 trucks. 84 were built until production ceased in August 1950. They replaced life-expired cars whose numbers they took. 120 entered service in 1936. The contrast between the conventional wooden cars and the aesthetically pleasing dome roof design is clearly visible. 69, the prototype Shrub Hill Standard in its first striking livery. 262 dated from 1934. As did 191, the last wooden standard to emerge from Shrub Hill. 59 was a former cable car. Automatic points were installed at most junctions, but at certain locations a points boy controlled movements. At the post office, this was by means of a points box mounted on the pavement. Young men also found employment in the corporation's parcel department. All deliveries were by tram or bus until 1933, when vans were introduced. The service was not discontinued until May 1966. Another feature was the occasional appearance of a decorated tram, for example during the royal visit of July 1934. The name of the undertaking changed in 1928 to Edinburgh Transport Department in recognition of the increasing role played by the motor bus. By 1936, when these scenes were taken, there were 215 buses operating, not only as feeders to the trams, but also on routes serving the peripheral housing estates. Eventually the buses were to challenge the supremacy of the tram. However, the tramway network continued to expand. Short additions were constructed between 1928 and 1934. These scenes, whilst reflecting tramway construction of the period, were actually taken during the building of the city's penultimate extension from Braids to Fairmile Head in 1936. Edinburgh's final extension brought the Corstorphine route to the Maybury in February 1937. The system had now reached its maximum at just over 46 miles. Authorised extensions to Kames, Sight Hill, Hill End and Crewe Toll were never built, although work did begin on the latter. To accommodate the fleet of 370 trams, Leith Depot was refurbished in 1937 to increase its capacity to 157 cars. In the mid-1930s, the trams dominated the city, carrying about 140 million people annually. Some of the heaviest loadings were associated with rugby matches at Murrayfield. Regular service cars were supplemented by streams of extras. During the game, these cars were parked at the extremity of the Corstorphine route, awaiting the mass exodus. In 1936, the fleet comprised a rich mixture of old and new. 322 dated from 1924. 72 was a veteran cable car with a new top deck. 268 was from 1929. 28 was one of the 1935 streamliners, whilst 227 was a Dick Kerr-built cable car of 1903 with a new top deck. Now two of the Metro Camel cars, 244 of 1934 and the flat-roofed number 260 of 1933. On the outbreak of war in September 1939, the steps and bumpers of all trams were painted white. Later, a white band was also added round the bottom of the body. Drivers wore their summertime white tops all year round, and conductresses were recruited from 1941. Starting in November 1946, 11 trams were acquired from Manchester. Being 3 feet longer than usual, they were confined almost exclusively to Service 21. Known as the Pilchers in their native city, they were dubbed the Manchesters in Edinburgh, or the big cars. Their arrival led to the withdrawal of the last of the ex-cable trams just prior to the city's first international festival in 1947. Further new Shrub Hill standards allowed for replacement of some 1922 wood cars by 1950. However, the long-term future of the system was now in doubt. Much of the infrastructure required renewal, extensions were needed to serve new housing developments, and expenditure was claimed to be exceeding revenue. As part of a general rationalisation, Service 18 was replaced in March 1950, the buses being extended at either end. In September 1951, the City Council voted to replace 5 tram services and scrap 25% of the fleet. The programme began on the 1st of June 1952 with the replacement of the short but heavily used Cumley Bank line. The colour lights for the 24 were red over red. These distinctive lights, discontinued during the war, had been reinstated in October 1946. They consisted of 2 circular discs, each with 6 aspects. Cumley Bank Terminus. The 24 was one of only 2 services regularly using George Street. The other was the 2, with its Saturday short working 22, which both closed on the 14th of December 1952. The 7-mile 2 linked Granton in the north with Stenhouse in the west. Stenhouse lost its trams as from the 29th of March 1953, when Service 3 to Newington was replaced by buses. Pre-war views. First of Gorgie Depot with its accommodation for 77 cars, and then Ardmillan Terrace Junction. Gorgie remained open until the 25th of April 1953. The final service to close during Phase 1 was the 4. Operating from Slateford to Piers Hill, it was historically interesting in that it covered the entire original electric line of 1910. Slateford Station. Following its reallocation to Leith Depot during its final few days, streamliners appeared on the 4. Interlaced track outside the Caledonian Brewery in Slateford Road allowed lorries to load at the curb. As a result of the Phase 1 closures, some 60 cars were sold to Connell of Coat Bridge. Their scrap value, £91 10 shillings. Those withdrawn included 151, seen here in May 1951, before the controversial reappearance of adverts. Even whilst Phase 1 was being implemented, the fate of the rest of the system was being decided. Highly contentious sets of figures were produced by those advocating total abandonment. Finally, following a period of bitter and acrimonious debate, the Council voted in September 1952 by a narrow margin of just 10 votes to replace the remaining trams by buses within a 3-year period. 1954. This was the year during which Phase 2 of the replacement programme was carried out. 12 route miles were abandoned, 8 services either withdrawn or replaced by buses, and over 100 cars sent for scrap, including the short-lived Manchesters. It was the last year trams for Portobello and Joppa would load at Waterloo Place. Although the triangular junction at the post office would remain fully operational until May 1956. The hordes of buses surrounding St Andrew's Square would still be served by the trams for nearly 3 more years. In January 1954, a reorganisation resulted in services 10 and 16 exchanging their northern termini. Two north-south services and 13 east-west services still pass through the busy intersection of Hanover Street, Princes Street and the Mound. Automatic points have been installed here after the war. Although the wooden standards were disappearing, some, like 268 of 1929, would survive for another 2 years. When the routes using Princes Street were electrified, in order to counteract vehement objections to the erection of unsightly overhead wires, specially designed unobtrusive centre poles were used, and these, together with passenger loading islands, brought a sense of order and dignity to this most stately of thoroughfares. From July 1954, no trams would head west past the entrance to Princes Street Station. The One was the first of the quartet of routes heading west through Haymarket to be replaced by buses as from the 28th of March 1954. The One typified the city's pattern of operation in that it linked 2 outer suburbs via the city centre. Liberton, and 232 departs for the Maybury, a distance of 8.5 miles. The points at the West End are being manually operated. An inbound car passes beneath the bridge at Murrayfield Station. The elimination of the Corstorphine routes was completed on the 11th of July 1954, with the replacement of the 12, 25 and 26. 5.5 miles of track now fell into disuse. The 12 and 25 worked virtually in tandem with minor differences in the city. The 25s terminated at either Craig-and-Tinney Avenue or King's Road, the 12, the longest route at 11.25 miles, continuing on to Joppa. This exposed coastal section along Seafield Road linking Leith and Portobello had only opened in 1924. From July, Craig-and-Tinney Avenue in the distance would be the eastern limit of cars operating from Leith. The 7-mile 26 linked Piers Hill to Zoo Park via London Road. From St Andrew Street, all three routes worked together, offering an intensive level of service. The first of two famous clocks, this one at the West End. And the second at Haymarket. On international days, thousands would travel to and from Murrayfield by tram. With their high capacity, they were ideal for moving huge crowds swiftly and efficiently. These atmospheric scenes were reputedly taken on the last occasion trams were used for an international match in Scotland. Extra trains were run from Murrayfield Station. Sufficiently large numbers also alighted at Zoo Park to justify the addition of a third track. At the Maybury, however, there seems to be little evidence of passenger potential in these final day scenes. It is hard to imagine this was then the main road to Glasgow. An eastbound 25 sways along the worn rails of the 1937 extension. A streamliner picks up passengers at the Zoological Gardens. Inbound along Haymarket Terrace. This view of Shandwick Place clearly shows the severed tracks leading towards George Street. Corstorphine had been the collection point for condemned cars. Following abandonment, the outer track was retained for this purpose until the 15th of July, when 178 made the last one-way trip. The next two services to close were operated by cars allocated to Portobello Depot. The 15 was replaced on the 19th of September. No track was abandoned. The 5 followed on the 31st of October, part of London Road being closed and part of Churchill Junction. King's Road, Portobello, and a 15 reverses outside the power station for the 6-mile journey to Braids. The disused tracks leading to Haymarket are still in situ. The 15 was the first route passing through Toll Cross to go over to buses. Some 15s ran through to Fairmile Head. Morningside and a 5 departs for Piers Hill via the bridges. This section of London Road now lost its trams. The terminal siding at Northfield Broadway, Piers Hill. The closure of the trunk Portobello services, as from the 14th of November 1954, lopped off the last remnant of the eastern limb of the system. Neither was directly replaced by corporation buses. At the outer end, the 21 still operated over 3 miles of the former Musselburgh Company line, the final mile of which was single track with passing loops. Leven Hall, 7 miles from central Edinburgh. An inbound car turns into Linkfield Road. These signals protected car movements in and out of Tatty Loop, so named because of its proximity to a long-vanished potato field. On race days, large crowds would alight at Musselburgh. 167 sweeps into the centre of Musselburgh, the Honest Tune. The narrowest part of the High Street warranted the use of a short length of interlaced track. Crossing the River Esk on the western approaches to Musselburgh and the border with Edinburgh. Joppa, terminus for the 20 and a highly popular summer destination, required 2 crossovers. Portobello Depot was situated within a cramped site on the south side of the High Street. With accommodation for 53 cars, it was not used by buses and has since been demolished. Kings Road Junction, with an inbound car turning towards the city. Calton Hill and the Robert Burns Memorial. Waterloo Place. In the summer, thousands had once queued for a day by the coast or for a visit to the bathing pool at Portobello. Cars scrapped as a result of Phase 2 included the Manchesters, all withdrawn by May 1954. Also approximately 90 Wood Standards, the oldest, like 90 and 275, dating from 1923. 44 still carried a cable car top deck, as did 33. "200 had been built at Shrub Hill in 1928. The first Shrub Hill Standard casualty was 220, gutted by fire in May 1954. On the 1st of January 1955, there were still 180 cars, including some 60 wooden standards, operating from 2 depots on 14 services. Eight routes still ran east-west along Princes Street. 2 still crossed Princes Street, linking Hanover Street to the Mound. The grade on the steepest section of the Mound was 1 in 10. From the introduction of electric traction, all cars on services 23 and the already closed 24 had been fitted with special brakes. Eventually, all the trams were equipped with air-operated and magnetic track brakes. The heavily used Service 8 was replaced by buses as from the 3rd of April 1955. Linking Newington to Granton, it passed through some of the busiest commercial and residential sections of the city on its 5-mile journey. Hope Park Terrace Junction. Operating to a close 5-minute headway, the 8 formed part of the steady procession of trams descending into the city. With such an intensive concentration of routes, there was in many central area streets literally always a tram in sight. For example, this stretch by the old quad once supported 10 routes. At the post office, the 8s proceeded down Leith Street before branching off into Broughton Street. On alighting at Granton Square, passengers were immediately engulfed by the sounds and sights of the locomotives shunting at the busy port. With the threat of total closure, enthusiast tours were a regular feature of the final years. On the 10th of April 1955, car 91 was provided. From Newhaven, the tour headed along the coast tracks, through Seafield, to Craig and Tinney Avenue. Red Biddy also visited the same location on a tour on the 31st of July. Red Biddy was the local nickname for methylated spirits. Later, it swung slowly round the S-bend under Trinity Bridge. Ran onto the spur at Merchiston Place, Bruntsfield, and out onto the single track approaching Collington. Introduced in 1936 to relieve overcrowding on the 23 as far as Toll Cross, the 27 was the first of the trio of services operating along Collington Road to be replaced. Its southern terminus had changed several times, but at closure was Craiglockett Pond, Happy Valley. An inbound 27 passes Maggotland on the approach to Craiglockett Station, which was itself closed to traffic in September 1962. Polwarth Gardens. The busy junction of Home Street and Gilmore Place. This car shows Polwarth, then the 1954 terminus of the 27. The 4.5-mile journey took 30 minutes. Grinding up to George Street. The two trunk Collington-Granton services, 9 and 10, were both replaced as from the 23rd of October 1955. The 4-mile Collington route had so many interesting tramway features: single track, S-bends, tight curves, a virtual absence of motor traffic, an intensive service, and a village terminus. The first section of single line was outside the entrance to Merchiston Castle School. En route, there were no less than 8 part-way crossovers. Traffic to and from Fir Hill was generated from the nearby estates at Collington Mains and Oxgangs. Overlooking the Union Canal. Beyond Craiglockett Station, the road narrowed heading towards the city. The trams turned off Collington Road into Polwarth Terrace. These milk floats were a familiar sight in the 1950s. Note the nearness of the outbound track to the curb. Polwarth Grove crossover. The second length of single track was in Gilmore Place. In its heyday with 3 services, one of which, the 9, operated every 5 minutes, movements on and off the single line were controlled by automatic signals. The signal can be seen on the traction pole on the left. Off the single track and heading towards the King's Theatre. And the last crossover before turning into Holmes Street. Through the Toll Cross hub, down Lothian Road and on to Princes Street. The Post Office Junction. The 9 was the last route travelling up and down Broughton Street. With the loss of the 9 and 10, Granton would be served by only 4 routes. Edinburgh trams not only had coloured lights, but also a variety of different coloured front slip boards and side window boards. For example, the Thames displayed a yellow Var-Leith walk. These boards were used to give added route information, and the front boards also highlighted seasonal events and locations. Some final colour views on the outer end of the Colinton route. Note the prominent yellow front window board. "40" was eventually destined to be the last car to leave the terminus on the 22nd of October 1955. At the start of 1956, a concentration of north-south routes remained, operated by about 125 cars, including the few remaining wooden standards. Shortage of buses had deferred closure of the 7, together with the part day 17, until the 11th of March 1956. Hurst Nelson-built experimental car 231 approaches Liberton Terminus. The trams reversed just clear of the busy crossroads. The journey time to Stanley Road was 40 minutes for the 6.5-mile trip. In June 1929, car 349 had run away down the 1 in 13 grade on Liberton Bray. Fortunately, no one was injured. This was the terminus of the former 18, which had been replaced as early as 1950. Newington lost its rail service in September 1962. The part day 17 was not replaced by buses. One of the Pickering class approaches the terminal crossover. The 17s went to either Bernard Street or Granton, depending on the time of day. With a very frequent level of service, reversals in the middle of this busy carriageway were always considered somewhat hazardous. The 7 and 17 ran in tandem down to the post office and to the foot of Leith Walk, where they separated. The 7 terminated at the foot of Craighall Road. This 17 is returning from Granton. The closure meant the elimination of trams between Salisbury Place and Liberton. A Pickering reverses at Newington Station. Also withdrawn were the last of the wooden standards. The final journey by a wooden standard is believed to have been made by number 138 of 1933 on service 17 on Saturday evening, the 10th of March. Also scrapped was the last of the 1934 trio of English electric streamliners. The all-steel bodies had suffered badly from corrosion. Urgent resurfacing work led to the closure of the southern carriageway on Princes Street between the Mound and Castle Street between March and May 1956. Buses were diverted via George Street and Castle Street. Extra trams were operated on the outer clockwise 6. Leith Depot, the largest on the system, closed to trams on the 5th of May 1956. The building was converted for use as a bus garage. Services 13 and 14 were temporarily transferred to Shrub Hill. Services 6 and 19 were replaced by buses as from the 27th of May. This closure marked the first track abandonment at Toll Cross. The 6 dated from 1924 and the 19 from 1935. These views show one of Edinburgh's unique rewiring skates introduced in 1940-41 to assist in locating the wire during the blackout. They remained in general use at all termini and major crossovers. From Craigentinny Avenue terminus, it was just over a mile to the foot of Leith Walk, all of which track was abandoned. For the first half-mile, the 19s ran either beside or crossed under the railway tracks associated with Leith docks. This was the former limit of operation until the trams were extended to Portobello. Turning into Claremont Park. Here the cars ran alongside Leith links. Note the holder provided for the driver's reviving flask of tea. From Leith Walk, the 19s turned south to Hope Park Terrace. At the junction, they turned to run through the picturesque meadows. This length of track was opened in 1925. The junction with Marchmont Road and Service 6. This earlier view shows a 19 standing in Brougham Street, 4.5 miles and 30 minutes from Craig and Tinney Avenue. The first tracks to be abandoned at Tollcross were those in the background, used by the 6, the city's only truly circular service. It operated in both directions over a 3.5-mile circuit, taking 26 minutes. It was one of the most profitable routes on the Edinburgh system. Here a car is emerging from Tollcross Depot. Because of heavy patronage, anti-clockwise or inner 6s had their own loading island on Lothian Road alongside Princes Street Station. The circle linked the city with the salubrious south side suburbs of Marchmont and Grange. Being virtually rectangular in shape with a dent on the west side, it negotiated several right-angle bends. With Arthur's Seat in the background, a 6 crosses Hope Park Terrace Junction. Salisbury Place and Beaufort Road. Tollcross now became the only operational depot, the 13s and 14s having been transferred from Shrub Hill. It had a maximum capacity for 68 cars. "137 noses out of the confined depot entrance before proceeding forward on a short working to Waverley. Despite the spate of recent closures, Tollcross still exuded a defiant atmosphere of hustle and bustle. All remaining services now passed through the junction, and there were frequent crew changes. To facilitate further carriageway resurfacing on Princes Street, the tracks east of St Andrew Street were abandoned as from the 1st of June 1956, and services 11, 13, 14, 16 and 28 were diverted via St Andrew Square and York Place. Interestingly, the 16 had been rerouted via Leith Street in March, but it now joined the convoys of trams using this previously leisurely backwater. Note the super elevation to assist trams descending St Andrew Street to take the steeply angled curve into York Place. Several of these cars are working unnumbered extras. The eastern part of Princes Street was rapidly resurfaced. With no bus substitution, the very busy circular services 13 and 14 were withdrawn as from the 16th of June. But as a partial replacement, part-day service 16 was extended to Granton and operated at all times. The 13 and 14 provided a somewhat convoluted 8-mile figure-of-8 connection between the northern industrial and port areas of Granton, Newhaven and Leith and the residential southern suburbs of Churchill and Grange. Even locals were sometimes bemused by their configurations. Furthermore, the 13 took 42 minutes to make its circuit, the 14 only 40 minutes. On the Granton-Pilrig leg, the 14s operated outbound along Granton Road. Through Ferry Road, up to Pilrig, where Granton-bound 13s proceeded in the reverse direction. Following a layover at Granton Square, the 13s carried on in a clockwise direction towards Leith and eventually back to Pilrig. A streamliner approaches the junction at the foot of Craighall Road, a 7 bus swinging round to start its journey back to Libberton. Note the baggage on the front platform. Leyland Titan 575 caused a minor sensation when it appeared in 1955 in unpainted aluminium. This terminus was known as Stanley Road, following the extension of services 7, 11 and 28 down the hill in 1949. 2 streamliners take the S-bend over Lindsay Road Railway Bridge en route for Granton. This Art Deco streamliner almost looks out of place amongst the old fishermen's cottages at Newhaven. Here, a streamliner reverses on the Dock Gates crossover in Commercial Street, outside the Highland Queen whisky bottling plant. Further along Commercial Street and advertising a rival whisky, a Shrub Hill Standard crosses the Leith Dock Commission swing bridge. Passing the former Leith depot. This car is working the unnumbered Granton P-car service introduced in March to partially offset the loss of the 17. Peak hours still meant a non-stop line of trams carrying thousands up and down Leith Walk. Note the trolleys turned inwards towards the ornate centre poles, some of which had been uprooted from parts of the Leith system in 1922, at the time of the conversion from cable to electric. This short length of track on Leith Walk between Leopold Place and Piccadilly Place once carried the most number of services on any part of the Edinburgh system. From the 1st of June, southbound 13s had been rerouted via Piccadilly Place, while southbound 14s continued to use Leith Street. Having regained Princes Street, southbound 13s proceeded towards Toll Cross. Running alongside Brunsfield Links, a northbound 14 drops down towards the city. At Church Hill, a 14 turns onto Morningside Road. Two views now of the attractive S-bend leading in and out of Green Hill Gardens. 225 was the last new car to emerge from Shrub Hill in August 1950. On board a 13 now returning to Granton, round the S-bend and onto the single line section in tranquil Strathern Place. The junction with Marchmont Road, followed by a run along Beaufort Road and Grange Road to Salisbury Place. All the track from Church Hill to the foot of Leith Street was now scheduled to close. Trams would no longer pass famous landmarks like the Surgeons' Hall, nor cross the bridges. The post office was terminus for the unnumbered peak hour service introduced following complaints from dockers after withdrawal of the 17. Appropriately, the cars carried a white slipboard via Leith docks. These extras were also scheduled to be withdrawn. Leith Street, always something of a grimy canyon, has changed beyond all recognition since these scenes were taken showing the last tram services to tackle the steep 1 in 14 incline. Following withdrawal, the corporation lost little time in removing the rails. For some 5 years, the same depressing sights could be witnessed throughout the city. Interestingly, 169 traversed the rusty rails on the disused stretch of track between Granton and Granton Road Station on the 24th of June during an enthusiast tour. Ever more cars were now going for scrap. By mid-June 1956, the 2 Metro Camel steel cars of 1933 had been withdrawn. As had the stylish streamliners of 1935, numbers 11 to 18 with bodies by Hearst Nelson. Numbers 19 to 24 with bodies by English Electric, and the final batch 25 to 30 with Metro camel bodies. Inroads into the rest of the fleet included Hearst Nelson Experimental 239 of 1934 and Shrub Hill Standard 233 of 1936. The corporation failed in their resolve to remove all the trams in time for the 1956 International Festival. The 11 and 16 were not replaced until the 12th of September 1956. This midweek closure involved much of the former Leith system, as well as the surviving tracks through the West End. Also closed was the steep, mile-long climb from Braids to Fairmile Head, opened in April 1936 and used by both the 11 and 16. The 11 had undergone few alterations, whereas the 16 had been amended several times, the latest as recently as June. Fairmile Head was the most southerly point reached by the trams. A further extension to Hill End was never built. The 11 operated every 10 minutes on the 6-mile journey to Stanley Road, and the 16 every 10 minutes on the 7.5-mile trip to Granton Square. As with most of the city's main tramway arteries, there were several intermediate termini en route. Braids was served by numerous short working cars and was also terminus for the Part Day 28, basically a short working of the 11. Swing, swing, swing goes the trolley. The run from Braids to the city via Morningside was now one of the few remaining sections with a heavy concentration of trams. Despite there being only 4 routes, some 60 cars were still required. The oldest, 180, clatters over the abandoned points at Church Hill. Holy Corner, so called because of the plethora of churches. Two inbound cars turn towards Toll Cross at Merkeston Place. 88 glides past Brumsfield Links. During mid-afternoon, Toll Cross turned out numbers of additional cars ready for the evening peak. The tracks leading to and from the depot entrance would survive until final closure. However, trams were soon to disappear from Lothian Road, the West End, and from half a mile of Princes Street. 160 departs from the loading island nearest to the Usher Hall. With 3 services, the trams were still very much in evidence. Here they mingle with replacing buses at the West End. This had once been one of the busiest junctions on the system. This stretch of Princes Street had once carried 16 services. Note the attractive silver-painted poles. From the 12th of September, the part-day 28s were rerouted via the Old Town. After the 11th of September, the 28 would be the sole service operating east of Hanover Street. Until April 1957, green and cream SMT buses continued to occupy every available inch of St Andrew Square. Poor track maintenance, coupled with minimal repair work, meant that some car bodies had worked decidedly loose. At Pilrig, the 16s headed north deep into former Leith territory. This is the junction at the foot of Leith Walk, which had once been one of the most complex on the Edinburgh system. Skirting the statue of Robert Burns, a car turns from Constitution Street into Bernard Street with its three-track layout. In the heart of industrial Leith, this had been an extremely busy loading point at peak times. A swift way of dealing with a breakdown. Having lost its trolley head, contact is made with the overhead wire in a somewhat unorthodox fashion, enabling the disabled car to be shunted out of the way. Edinburgh had introduced carbon skids during the war to reduce sparking. The wire is now inspected for damage. The section of the former Leith system from Bernard Street to Granton was rich in interesting locations, including the swing bridge over the water of Leith, which had been closed to regular shipping since April 1955. The trams made a distinctive noise as they rumbled over the electrically controlled trap points on either side. These points opened as the bridge turned, drivers being warned by a semaphore signal arm. Buses were eventually diverted from this narrow part of Newhaven. Note how the cobbles have sunk around the trackwork at the foot of Craighall Road. Inbound 16s pass alongside the harbour wall on Trinity Crescent. From its inception, the intriguing tram pinch at Trinity Bridge was guarded by signals activated by a chain attached to a traction pole. This was operated by the conductors. On the run into Granton, the trams paralleled the railway branch which closed in 1986. The 16 was the last of 7 routes which had once terminated at Granton. The journey time back to Fairmile Head via the coast road was 45 minutes. A decidedly travel-stained and weary 180, now the only non-standard tram on the system, heads back towards Craighall Road. Note the flags attached to the trolley rope. These were used on festive occasions, especially during the International Festival. From the terminus at the foot of Craighall Road as far as Newhaven Road, the 11s negotiated 2 severe right-angle bends, each restricted to single track only. A double-headed goods train steams towards Leith North on the former Caledonian branch. The intersection of Newhaven Road and Ferry Road was another major junction on the old Leith system. All the track from Craighall Road to the Mound would continue to be used by the 28. Here was the site of the Pilrig Muddle, former interchange point between the Edinburgh and Leith systems. Cars withdrawn during the autumn included the prototype Shrub Hill Standard 69 of 1934. Approximately 40 cars remain to work the 23 and 28. Approximately 40 cars now remained to work the 23 and 28. Others were departing regularly for scrap. For a while, Connells had uplifted cars in North Junction Street, but latterly operations have been transferred to the yard at Shrub Hill. Aware that the trams would soon be gone, Edinburgh Corporation sanctioned the making of a film to demonstrate some salient aspects of tramway operation. Car 91 has been driven under its own power into the specially constructed cradle. There it was uplifted off the road and clamped in situ for the journey to Coat Bridge. Owing to the cramped nature of the Victorian works, a traverser was needed to reach certain areas. Some brickwork had also been removed to accommodate the longer Manchester cars. Here, a body is uplifted from its Peckham P22 truck. One result of the scrapping programme had been the high level of standardisation achieved as non-standard equipment was transferred to cars going for scrap. By 1956, all remaining trams had two Metrovic 101 motors. The controllers were all BTH B510s with the Malian Taunton air brake interlock mounted on the controller top. Many traditional practices were inevitably set to disappear. For example, the maintenance and repair of a typical tram seat. The vintage trackwork car was the oldest vehicle in the fleet. In this sequence, it is in attendance at a specially staged demonstration of track maintenance. This labour-intensive activity was usually carried out at night to avoid major disruption to the service. Sadly, in latter days, too much of the Edinburgh track was in parlous condition. Current is being drawn from the overhead wire. Here the sets are being repositioned. And so back to the works. Damaged or broken overhead could lead to a severe disruption in the service. Called on the radio telephone, the Austin Tower wagon could be swiftly summoned to undertake any required surgery. Again, this scene was specially staged. At Pilrig Junction, conveniently close to Shrub Hill Works. The remaining two tram lines were both of historical significance. The 23 covered all of the city's first cable route, whilst the 28 travelled over part of the original horse-car route of 1871. The heavily used and profitable 23 dated from 1924. The 28 was a relative latecomer, being first introduced in 1946. Both ceased operation during the early evening of Friday, the 16th of November. The part day 28 covered 1.5 miles of the former Leith system en route to Pilrig. Note the superb ornate centre poles. These tracks in Dryden Street gave access to the rear of Shrub Hill Works and dated from 1922. The 23 also covered part of the old Leith system as far as Golden Acre. From Golden Acre it ran 1.5 miles along the full length of the first 1888 cable route. Cars climbed steadily into the heart of the new town, the steepest section being 1 in 11. Crossing George Street. The 23s operated every 5 minutes over their 5-mile route. There were also various extras, especially on Saturdays. Created in June 1924, the 23 linked the former steeply graded cable lines on either side of Princes Street. The curves leading from the Mound into Princes Street were so sharp the rails took a left sweep to obtain the tightest radius permitted. The lady on the left is transferring from a 28 onto a 23. Owing to the steepness of the various grades, drivers originally received an extra halfpenny an hour. With a grade of 1 in 10 on parts of the descent, cast steel bollards were fixed in the pavement to deter runaways from plunging onto the railway beneath. A double S-bend led into North Bank Street. The Bank of Scotland lowers over George IV Bridge. The two last routes served some of the busiest sections of the old town. At Lauriston, passengers alighted for the Royal Infirmary, the George Heriot School, and the many small neighbourhood shops and houses. To coincide with the fixed visiting hours of the time, trams even shuttled the half-mile between the Mound and the infirmary. Down into Toll Cross, now a shadow of its former self, through the suburbs, and out to Morningside Terminal Stub. To mark the demise of the trams, 172 was painted in a predominantly white livery and was illuminated at night by 500 12-watt bulbs. Between the 12th and 16th of November, it toured the remnants of the network. Special tickets were issued on all cars during this final week. From 10 a.m. on the last day, the restored horse bus toured various parts of the city. "172 showed X on its number blind, and all cars in use on the last day carried flags on their trolley ropes. Morningside. William Moffat, with 40 years' service, was allocated to drive 172. Braids was only served by the 28, the cars taking 42 minutes to cross the city to Stanley Road. Descending from Braids to Morningside. Even the veteran trackwork car made a twilight appearance. Normal service continued until 6 o'clock. The last southbound trams left Granton Road Station at 6:57 and Stanley Road at 7 o'clock. "172 and 88 joined a procession of 9 reserve cars assembled at Braids. Only ticket holders were allowed on board. Preceded by the restored horse bus drawn by 2 milk-white horses, 172 and 88 and 217, which had joined the cortege at Morningside, stopped at the foot of the mound. Following presentation and speeches, 172, shrouded in its ghostly white garb, led the way for the last time along Princes Street to Shrub Hill. Thousands had gathered to watch the passing of an era. The final cars to enter the Leith Walk entrance of the works were number 88 of 1935, driven by James Pride, and last of all number 217 of 1947 at 8:45, driven by James Kay. Interestingly, the electric trams had survived 34.5 years, less than either the horse or cable trams. The power, except in the works, was switched off almost immediately. The wires were swiftly dismantled on Princes Street, and 217 was dispatched for scrap the next day. For over 2 months, redundant trams were hauled away to the graveyard at Coat Bridge. Shrub Hill had maintained and built horse, cable and electric cars. For many of the staff, the sad dismemberment of the tramway must have been a personal tragedy. Perhaps someone with a sense of history selected 83, the oldest surviving Shrub Hill standard, to make the final trip to Connell's Yard on the 23rd of January 1957. Connell was later to scrap scores of Glasgow trams. One Edinburgh car escaped the flames. This was number 35 of 1948. Originally, the newest car, 225, had been earmarked for